What's up, Internet? This is Josh, and welcome back to this tutorial series. Today we're going to expand on our farming game a bit and give our plant locations the ability to actually grow and manage the plant's life cycle so that you need to water it and advance to the next stage and eventually become harvestable. Give the player the ability to harvest plants and fulfill the fantasy of our little farming game here. So let's get ready to think like developers. First thing we want to look at today here is that last time we set up our collision here in the plant location so that when the player touches the plant location, it looks at the current state of our plant and says, depending on what state you're in, let's look at what is in the player's hand. So if there's nothing planted in the ground, let's see what the player is holding, and then depending on that, if it's a valid seed, then we can plant that in the ground. And it's a good idea to have this planting functionality broken out into its own function, but it's a little awkward that we have this tree here, and then we also have this tree here. And just in general, the fact that we have seed 1, seed 2, seed 3 is a little bit strange. Generally, it's not the worst thing ever to have this functionality abstracted a little bit so that if you ever decide that it's changing from a pumpkin seed to like a cabbage seed or, I don't know, a coconut seed or, whatever. I don't know, do coconuts grow from seeds? Then it's not too hard to make all those switches in the code. But effectively, the problem we're running into is that our seeds are effectively all the same tool, but the difference is between them is basically just what seed is being planted. And so in a way, our tool type here, or I guess it's over here in globals, these seeds are almost more a subset of our tools rather than tools in themselves. So what we want to do is break them out so that rather than having seed 1, seed 2, seed 3, we can just say it is a seed, and then we can have our tools have a seed type, which tells us a little bit more precisely what the seed is, rather than trying to overload this tool with a bunch of information about what seeds are. If we come over here, we want to add a seed type to our tool here. And now that this is all set up, what we can do is if we go over to our plant location, then we kind of don't need this first if tree here. When we process the initial collision with the player, we can just say that if you're holding any type of seed in your hand, then we actually want to use that seed type, and we just need to update our plant seed function here to take the seed type rather than the actual tool. Now in here, we can change this to look for our seed type rather than our tool type. And this seed type is something that we're going to need to hold on to for future things. So we can make a reference to our SeedType Enumerator here, and we can say that, while it's in the unplanted state, our planted seed is none. And simply store this value here when we actually do the plant seed functionality. Now that we've separated this out from processing the actual collision, now this collision has just this one nice little function call, and we can worry about what the actual seed is down here in plant seed. If we come over to our tools here, we just need to fix up these setups a little bit. So seed 1 is now tool type seed and seed type pumpkin. Seed 2 is now tool type seed type cabbage. Seed 3 is now tool type seed type carrot. And if we run that, everything seems to basically function the same. The first plant seed that we plant the seed, and with future seeds, now that the plant location is in growing state, we can't plant future plants. But we ultimately want our plants to grow, and like we talked about last time, we have this whole sequence of growing graphics here where the plant proceeds through these and then reaches one of these. So let's start setting up that whole sequence of the plant's life cycle. And the way we're going to do that is basically just by storing what actual step we're in. It starts at 0, increases upwards. And then we're also going to need a timer. And then finally, rather than using a magic number to set how long the timer actually is, we should store that value somewhere. And so now the idea here is that when we start off, our plant starts at seed step 0. We set our plant timer to 3 seconds. And then as time goes on, our timer decreases. And when it gets to 0, our seed step is going to advance to seed step 1. We reset our timer again. It decreases. And then we just kind of continue on until we get to the final step in our plant's life cycle. So we can handle all of that in its own function. And so the idea is, when we plant a new seed, set to growing step 0. And then in here, in the set growing step, we can store what the actual step is. Access that later. We need to set the timer. And then all of this graphical stuff, rather than setting the actual final seed graphic when we plant the seed, we only actually care about any of this when we're on the last step of the growth. So let's not worry about that for now. And instead, we can use the array of graphics that we set up and use our seed step, which it starts at 0 and advances upwards. And so now, if we're on seed step 0, we should show this graphic. If we're on seed step 1, we should show this graphic. If we're on seed step 2, we should still show this graphic, etc. And then finally, we need a way to actually update our timer. We can do that down here in update, and similar to how the input controller, we ask Unity what the time in between frames is, we can use that same information to determine how much our timer updates every frame. So if we just reduce our seed timer by that amount every frame, then we get an accurate representation of how much time has passed. And then if the seed timer is less than 0, we know that the appropriate amount of time has elapsed, and we can advance to the next seed step. And we could simply just say, set growing step to whatever the current step is plus 1. But this just gives us, by separating this out into its own function, advanced seed step, this just gives us a little bit more control and allows us to kind of separate out our logic where we're setting versus our logic when we're advancing the seed step. And so if we want to reuse this set logic, we can, maybe if we're potentially doing something in the start function, or if we're ever initializing or resetting our plant location, then we can use this and not worry about our advancing logic having to manage that at the same time. So then in here, we can say the seed step increases by 1, and then use that new seed step value to set where we are in the growing logic. And now, if we run the game, we can see things are a little bit weird. Not quite exactly what we expect to happen. Our plant is kind of growing on its own without us having to actually plant the seed. And when it gets to the end of the life cycle here, it's starting to throw errors for us. So we've got a little bit of work to do to make this code a little bit safer. So first off, the problem that we're having here is that our update function is always running. And so we're always updating our seed timer. And so it's trying to advance to the next seed step, even if our plant state is in unplanted. So basically, even though our plant hasn't been actually planted yet, it's coming in here and saying advanced step, seed step, we're setting it to 1 or plus 1 at least. And then we're going to the next seed step. And then in here, we're resetting the timer and we're updating the graphic. So we know at least that this cycle is working, that the timer is working and things are advancing, but it's starting without us wanting it to. And this is where our state machine comes in. So down here, if we just check for the actual growing state to make sure that we're only actually advancing this timer when we're growing, then that should solve our first problem of the plant kind of being planted and advancing on its own, even though a seed hasn't actually been planted in it yet. The other problem we're having is when the plant gets to the end of its life cycle, even though it's currently, advancing on its own, when this value of the seed step gets too far, it's trying to access this growing graphics array, and it's saying, let's look at element 0, okay, let's look at element 1, let's look at element 2, let's look at element 3, and then it's saying, let's look at element 4, because the advanced step is just continually going, there's nothing to tell it to stop growing. But there aren't 4 or more elements in this array, and so that's where our index out of range exception is coming from. And so down here in our advanced seed step logic, which we made a point of breaking out earlier, we can set up some logic to handle this for us. So we want to make sure that the seed step is less than the size of our growing graphics array. And then we want to use a -1 value because this length returns kind of like the absolute length of our array. So if there's 4 elements in it, like in our case, it'll return 4. But the last element in the array is stored at index 3. So that's just kind of like a little bit of a quirk of the way arrays work. We just want to check the -1 of the length. But in this case, we want to update our seed step. And then otherwise, if our seed step is the last element in our array here, then what we actually want to do is, instead of updating the seed step, it's not growing anymore. Now our plant is harvestable. So again, if we break this out into a separate function, we can worry about all the implications of that down here. And effectively, all we want to do is, if we just reuse this if tree that we remade earlier, this is where we actually do want to set the final graphics for our seeds. And we just need to check the actual type of what our planted seed is. Now if we give this a run, our location doesn't update to any seeds until we plant anything. If we do anything with our tools or anything like that, nothing happens. We can plant a... Oh, we can't plant a seed. Oh, interesting. So what it's doing is it's planting the seed, but it's setting ourselves to step 0, but the step 0 is the same graphic as our... Maybe we can visualize this a bit better. If we click on the debug tab of our plant location here, we can see some of the values that we set up for ourselves here. See if we can visualize what's happening. We grab the pumpkin seed, and then we step on top of the plant location, and just pause the game real quick. We can see that our seed did get set. Our plant is currently in the growing state. Our plant is successfully set to pumpkin, and our seed timer is started at 3 and is decreased. It's currently at 1.9 and going down. And our seed step is set to 0. And so what's happening is it doesn't look like anything has happened because we set ourselves to this graphic, which is index 0 in the array. So rather than starting at step 0, we can say start at step 1. And we can treat step 0 as the unplanted state, and step 1 is when our actual growing logic starts. Now we grab the seed. Let's look at our plant location real quick. Currently, no planted seed, unplanted state. It immediately goes to step 1, then step 2, then step 3. And then, do we get our final graphic? It doesn't look like we get our final graphic. I wonder why that is. Because we're using graphics.length instead of graphics.length -1. Potentially, we could also, instead of making this an actual else if, we could just say, else. But just making it an else if makes it a little bit safer, so you're not potentially trying to handle any cases where seed step is less than 0 or anything like that. But we just need to fix up that equation real quick. Now, finally, it's plant 1, plant 2, plant 3, and pumpkin. So now nothing happens if we walk over it. It should just be, let's look at our debug here. The timer is still decreasing, but nothing happens. It can just keep on decreasing until eternity, and it's just fine. Nobody cares. Technically, if it goes on long enough, it'll like overflow and become like 2 billion or something like that. But it'll probably are you gonna wait around for 2 billion seconds? I kind of doubt it. So yeah, it's just set to pumpkin and then growing until we do anything with it. In theory, this is where we would then grab our scythe and step over top of it, but we don't have any of that harvesting logic yet. And then I do also want to set the Z position of our plant location to 0.5 here, just because I notice our player is drawing beneath the location. So our player's location is being set, our Z location is being set every frame, or at least every frame that they move. Setting our plant location is just easier than changing the player location. While we're here, let's make a few other small changes to our plant location here. For one, it should really be a prefab, much like our tool, because we could very easily just make a few more of them. So if we do that, now, because our objects are nice and modular, each one will kind of handle itself separately. So we can plant seeds in each individual location, and they'll each grow on their own. You can see the pumpkins grow into pumpkins. Our cabbage will grow into a cabbage. And so it's nice to have our plant locations here set up as a prefab. And then one other thing that's we can do is if we reparent these, call this our plant row. And then what we also want to do is just give ourselves a background element. Now that our plants are kind of advancing from this kind of dirt state, and we're kind of missing the background once it kind of advances. So what we want, or at least what I'm going to do, is make another element and kind of play around with this a little bit. Okay, and actually I'm using the wrong background. Rather than using this guy, I want to use this bigger one that I prepared that doesn't need to be scaled up quite so massively. So maybe like this, maybe a little bit bigger. There we go. And then let's probably use these. Not sure why it's offset, but anyways. Okay, something a little bit more like this. And so now it just looks a little bit nicer. We've got a little bit of a background. It doesn't look so much like the plant disappears when it gets planted. And the other thing we need is, now that our plant location is a prefab, we need a way to actually display when it needs watering. Because at the moment, the timer just kind of advances automatically and the plant grows up on its own. But we ultimately want is for the player to have to water the plant for it to advance to the next stage in its life cycle. And so we're going to need a way to communicate that to the players when the plant is ready to be watered. Which is why we have prepared our little water graphic here. So we're just going to need a way of applying that to our prefab. So we need another object to make it our water graphic. We need our Z to be a bit closer. Oh, yeah, okay, well, I think that works. I'll have to try that a little bit. Maybe we want to make it a little bit smaller. That might be too small. Probably works. And the idea is we kind of want this to just be positioned a little bit above the plant. Let's look at how that looks. Maybe... Okay, and we can call this our water graphic. And then we're going to need a reference to that. Actually, let's get, instead of the game object, let's get a reference to our sprite renderer. Our sprite renderer, any component that is attached to a game object automatically has a reference to the game object. So rather than in code trying to get a reference to the game object itself, sometimes it's easier to just get a reference to the component, since we know we can always access the game object off of that component if we do ever need it for some reason. And then to actually control this icon object, then much like we've been doing with a lot of our other kind of functionality throughout the location here, a good idea is just to make a function that will handle all the things that we need to do in order to manage it, and just kind of make it all happen in one place, so that if we need to make any updates to that later, it's easy to find and refer to and update that flow. So if we just tell it whether we need water or not, we can just set the enabled state, enabled of whatever we're passing into here. We know that by default, when the game runs, at first, we want to hide the water droplet until a valid plant is planted. And then when you actually plant a seed, we want to set the requirement of watering the plant to true. This is another thing that we can probably store in a variable here. And now that our water functions are all kind of handled in one place, we know that no matter where our set needs water is being called from, this is the only place we really need to interact with it, so we can store the value here. And then in order to actually, water the plant, we don't actually need a function for that at the moment, because we can just call set needs water to false. And the easy way to do that is if we just come up here, and we already have a place for our growing state logic to check where that's happening when the player interacts with the plant location. And so now we have this logic for processing what happens when the player has a seed in their hand. If they have a bucket in their hand, if our plant is growing, then this is where we're checking to see if the plant needs watering or not. So we also want to check needs water, and if it does, well, we're watering the plant, so it no longer needs water. And then the last thing we need to do is we need to make sure that the actual seed timer only updates when the plant doesn't need water. So the idea is when the player plants the plant, initially it needs water. When the player waters the plant, it can then start growing until it reaches the next stage. When it does reach the next stage, then we set that the plant needs to be watered again, because it goes back to, we're advancing to the next step of the life cycle, so it needs to be watered in order to advance again. So if we do that, as long as the plant needs water, we can process this update. So we need to actually set this up, set the water icon in data. If we run that, then we'll plant the seed. Initially it needs water. You can see nothing. Let's scroll down to the timer here. We can see that the timer isn't updating because we haven't watered the plant yet. So now when we water the plant, timer starts decrementing until it gets down to 0. Oh, it's not. Well, the water is not getting set back on to needed when you set a new plant. So let's see what's happening. Oh, I never actually set it to do that. So when you advance the growing step, it needs to turn the water back on. Okay, there we go. So you plant the plant. Let's get our debug here. Now it needs water, so we water it. Timer starts going down. Now it needs water again. And repeat. Now that it's at its final stage, interacting with the water bucket doesn't do anything. Interacting with the plant doesn't do anything. And we don't have any logic for harvesting yet. So that's what we're going to take care of next time. But for now, we've gone through and set up the plant life cycle for our watering logic and how the plant grows and all that, which is pretty cool. We're going to add a little bit more gameplay mechanics and stuff next time. But just because this is a little bit complicated, I want to kind of go over it again real quick just to kind of talk a little bit about how the flow of the code, just because using a lot of functions and making it very flexible like this also has the downside of sometimes it creates a lot of jumping around in the code, which can be a little bit hard to follow. So just to recap, basically what's happening here is when the plant location starts off its life, its current state is it has nothing in it. So when the player interacts with the plant location here, if they have a seed in their hand, then they're just going to plant the seed. So we plant the seed, and we set it to growing step 1, which is basically the smallest possible sprout, because the kind of dirt patch is what we're calling growing step 0, an empty slate. And so we're also kind of storing some values, and I guess we probably don't actually need this here as well, but effectively, when we plant the seed, we're setting it to the next step in the plant life cycle, and every time you set the plant to the next step in the life cycle, which happens here, we're updating the graphic and we're telling it that it needs more water in order for it to continue in the plant life cycle. The way that happens is down here in the update. If the plant is growing, then the timer is continually going down, down, down. So as long as the plant has been watered, the timer is going to decrement and eventually reach 0. When it does, that's when the plant is actually going to grow. But if it doesn't have water yet, it's going to wait to be watered until it can start growing. And then once it does advance to the next step of its life cycle, if it's still in those kind of growing stages, our growing step is going to update so that we can set the growing step again, come back in here and start all over again. We need more water, we're updating our graphic again. But instead, if we're at the last step of the process, this is where we're going to set our plant as harvestable. Where'd that function go? Oh, right here. And at the moment, all this is doing is updating us to our final graphic, but next time we're going to update this flow so that we can kind of reset the plant location, reuse it to plant more seeds, and also process the harvesting, and because that is ultimately the goal of our game, is we need to plant enough plants and harvest enough plants in order to win. So we need a way of processing when that harvesting happens, storing those values, and kind of updating the player and telling them what their progress is like. But yeah, things are really starting to come together pretty quickly now as we're starting to define our functionality, and we don't have a whole lot more to go before we actually have a fully working gameplay loop. So hopefully you're as excited about this as I am, and hopefully you learned something. But either way, thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and catch you in the next episode. See you later.